All right, in this within subjects ANOVA practice worksheet, what you'll notice is it looks actually pretty similar to the between subjects ANOVA practice worksheet that you did a couple of weeks ago. As you can see on the first page, what you're going to do is to use each one of these summary tables and take the data that I've provided you and use it to fill in the statistics that are indicated by a blank. So in this table, for instance, you'll notice I've already calculated out the mean squares, so you don't need to know any of these other terms over here. The mean squares have already been provided for you. All you need to remember is which of these mean squares you use to calculate the F. If you've forgotten, or if you forgot how to calculate any of these, say sum of squares total or degrees of freedom, all you have to do, as with also any exam that I give you, is to scroll down and take a look at this table down at the bottom. And what this table is designed to do is to remind you how to calculate any one of these statistics. So for instance here, the sum of squares between is the sum of the mean minus the grand mean squared. If you forget what any of these individual symbols stand for, like M, just look up above and I've tried to give you a key. M is the group mean, GM is the grand mean, X is an individual score, etc. So on this very first page, you'll start by calculating the F. And as you work your way on down, what you'll see is there's progressively more and more pieces of information missing. So what you're going to need to do is to reference that back sheet that I just showed you in order to help figure out some of these, for instance, missing degrees of freedom, in order to figure out how exactly do you go about calculating degrees of freedom subject versus total, etc. And in this very last problem on the first page, notice I've given you none of the degrees of freedom, but you do know that there are 85 participants and 5 groups. Okay, one of the things I do want to remind you of is that for this, as well as for the factorial ANOVA, the number of participants, or let's see, we have the number of participants or number of subjects is different from the number of observations. So you want to pay close attention to when you're asked to use the number of subjects or participants and when you're asked to use the total number of observations. Okay, once you finish this first page, then the assignment for the second page is you're going to complete a full summary table. And you're going to do that in the way that we've done it before, which is to use the data I provided for you in order to calculate out first the sum of squares between, or the SSA, the sum of squares subject, and the sum of squares total. Now in this one, I'm only requiring you to do 3 out of the 4, because remember, if you calculate out 3 of these, you can find the value for the 4th one. Okay, so you're going to do that. I just want to point out a couple things with respect to this data. First of all, what I've done in this worksheet for you is I've already set up these columns in a way that they feed directly into the kind of sum of squares I'm asking you to do. Now on an exam, these columns up at the top will be blank. You'll have to remember what do I put up here in order to get my sum of squares between, for instance. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, in each one of these, you'll now see 2 columns instead of just 1 column. In every other ANOVA table, I've given you an X, meaning the individual data points. But what we've never seen before is this subjects row. So what I want to point out is what this is communicating. So if we take a look at this first line right here, what this means is participant number 1, subject 1, after completing the placebo experimental condition, scored a 7 on whatever measure this is. That same participant, after completing the drug condition, scored a 5. And that same participant scored a 3 after the therapy condition. So notice we have 1 participant, but 3 different scores. And we're going to see the same thing for each one. This is going to be really important when you come down here and you have to calculate out things like the subject mean. This is subject 1. This is subject 3. Each one of those is a different subject or participant. Okay, and once you're finished with all those, all the sum of squares, you'll be able to calculate the missing sum of squares over here. You can use the tables and the clues in the back to remember how do we calculate out these degrees of freedom. then use those to calculate out the mean squares for all three, and remember which of those two we need to calculate in order to find the final F value. If you have questions about it, don't hesitate to send me a message. Otherwise, I'm looking forward to going over this in class.